Welcome everyone to our education session this afternoon. My name is Annette Johns, and I am the Associate Director of Policy and Practice with the Newfoundland and Labrador Association of Social Workers. I have the honor of being the moderator for today's education event titled Educating Effective Social Workers, Innovative Approaches to Prepare for and Enhance Field Education. We have hundreds of social workers tuning in from across Canada today, which is excellent. This webinar is being brought to you by the Newfoundland and Labrador Association of Social Workers, Memorial University School of Social Work, and the Canadian Association of Social Workers. The webinar presentation will be approximately 60 minutes, and we will have two opportunities for questions, one about midway through and another towards the end of the presentation. Please send in your questions throughout the presentation, and only myself and the presenters will see the questions that you have coming in. All of the housekeeping details you need, like how to access the recording, where to download the slides, and how to get your certificate of attendance are all included in the housekeeping widget that popped up when you first logged in. I now want to introduce our speaker, Dr. Marion Bogo. Dr. Bogo is a registered social worker in Ontario and is a professor at the Factor in Montage Faculty of Social Work, University of Toronto. She received a Significant Lifetime Achievement in Social Work Education Award from the Council on Social Work Education in the United States in 2013, was appointed as an Officer, Order of Canada in 2014, and received an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from Memorial University of Newfoundland in 2018, all for her contributions to social work education. The Memorial University School of Social Work is celebrating 50 years of social work education in Newfoundland and Labrador this year. And Dr. Bogo received her honorary degree during the spring convocation as part of the celebration of this significant milestone in social work education in our province. Dr. Bogo brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise on the topic of field education, and so without further ado, I will now pass things over to Dr. Bogo to begin her presentation.
Thank you, Annette. It's a real pleasure for me to be able to be speaking to social workers across Canada about this very interesting and compelling topic of how do we educate effective social workers. So I'm thrilled that the association in Newfoundland asked me to do this presentation, and I must confess that I'm a bit of a newcomer to webinar presentations, so I hope that what I have to say and the way I say it reaches all of you and is helpful in your interest in social work education and in preparing the next generation of the profession. So what I'm hoping to do today is engage you in thinking about what are our educational goals, and then talk about over 10 years of research and innovation in using simulation to prepare students for the practicum. That will be the focus of the first half of my talk. The second half will focus on best practices in field education. And you could say that I'm trying to summarize decades of research conducted by my research team and colleagues throughout North America, the UK, Australia, Hong Kong, trying to bring all of the evidence that we have about what leads to effective social work graduates. I'm trying to summarize this in an hour and a half. So let's begin then by asking you to take a moment and think about what are our educational goals. What kind of social workers do we want to graduate? What is your vision of effective social work? Before I ask you to actually respond to some questions, I just want to briefly note that whenever a social worker takes on the responsibility of being a field instructor, you're given a lot of input and information from the School of Social Work regarding their curriculum, their goals, what they want you to teach. But what we found from our research, which I'll be talking about soon, is that every social worker has their own implicit, not necessarily articulated, ideas about what is crucial for effective social work practice. And this is true at all levels: micro, direct practice, meso, community practice, and macro, social policy change, social action, social administration. So what I would like you to do is jot down on your own what kind of social worker you want to graduate, your vision of effective social work. When I do this in a face-to-face workshop, we then have an interesting interchange where participants are able to share what their ideas are. Since we're on a webinar, instead of sharing, I'm going to ask you to respond to the following. What 3 competencies would you rate as the most important? And these are competencies that have come from the mouths of field instructor social workers as I've done this kind of workshop around the country. So the first idea is forming an empathic relationship with clients. The next one is working with interprofessional teams, applying theory and research evidence to practice, working with diversity and difference, linking to resources, ability to form an assessment, involvement in continuing education. So could you take a moment and highlight 3 competencies that you would say are the most important? And I'll just pause for a moment so that you can all check off the 3 that you think are the most important. So I'm seeing the results, and I hope you are seeing them also. Very interesting that 75% of the participants on the line are identifying an empathic relationship as the cornerstone or foundation for practice. And you probably know the common factors approach has demonstrated through considerable research that the nature of the relationship accounts for fully 30% of the outcomes that we can expect in working with clients. I see then that 65% are indicating working with diversity and difference. And this is certainly reflective of our Canadian society that is so rich and so diverse, multiracial, multi-ethnic, age, gender, and so forth. The next highest ranking appears to be the ability to form an assessment. And we know that good social work practice is focused, intentional, and as a result really has to focus on a robust and solid assessment. So thank you for this input. Now let's compare it to what we found from our research. What we did was we interviewed experienced field instructors. So we had in-depth interviews with 19 experienced field instructors in working in child welfare, health, mental health, and services to the elderly. We then also did a second study where we had 18 instructors who were involved in meso-macro practice. We asked them for detailed descriptions of their exemplary student, their average student, and students in difficulty, and this produced 57 micro descriptions and 54 macro descriptions. We subjected this to a qualitative analysis, and we came up with these dimensions. So learning and growth was a very high competency that was identified both by micro and macro instructors. Behavior in the organization, and that would map onto our earlier question about working with interprofessional teams. Clinical relationships, that maps directly onto forming an empathic relationship with clients. And our macro instructors talked about providing leadership. Interestingly, applying theory and evidence to practice, this idea of conceptualizing practice, or as the macro instructors talked about it, critical thinking, analysis, planning, and implementation. In the macro identification of analysis is this idea of assessment, and you can see on the micro side, assessment and intervention were grouped together. And that again maps on to those of you who identified the ability to form an assessment. The macro instructors talked separately about values and ethics, whereas the micro instructors included that in talking about assessment and intervention. And finally, both groups talked about communication. So what's especially interesting here is that the responses from those of you on the webinar were actually very similar to these two samples of experienced field instructors with respect to this topic. So from this analysis, we moved on to developing the idea of holistic competence. And we've had some tense debates in Canada between the regulators, the colleges of social work, and the schools of social work about what competence is and what it means. From my research, I and my team developed this notion of holistic competence. So competence is far more than just the ability to perform, to do what we've called procedural competence, which essentially is behaviors and skills. But what we found from our research was that metacompetencies matter. And metacompetencies are higher order, overarching capabilities that involve conceptual thinking, critical thinking, judgment, includes values, definitely includes professionalism, self-awareness, emotional regulation, use of self, and learning and growth as a professional. So with this idea of holistic competence, we really must, in the universities and in the field, teach for integration. So another way of picturing this is this diagram. Procedural competencies are embedded in the metacompetencies. What we do should be informed by the way we're thinking and the way we're feeling. And then we broke it down even more into this somewhat more complex diagram. And if any of you are interested in reading more about this diagram, I can give you references at the end of the webinar. So essentially what this model does is it puts together on the top the recognition that social work practice is essentially organizationally and community-based. In other words, the roles that we play in our practice are very much mandated by the organization that we work for. And the way in which we can carry out our interventions are very much affected by the community context, the nature of the population, their values, how they go about seeking help, what they consider as helpful and what they consider as not helpful. On the bottom of the diagram is our professional context, the enduring and ever-expanding value base of social work. I'd then like to direct your attention to the middle of this diagram, complex practice behaviors. So complex practice behaviors are those dimensions that we started off talking about at the beginning of this webinar. They're the ability to engage clients and communities. They're the ability to form productive empathic relationships, to conduct joint assessments, joint with the client, so that we arrive at shared understandings that leads to meaningful planning, intervention, and evaluating whether the intervention was useful. So complex practice behaviors involve a number of dimensions. The way in which we express those dimensions are through the use of skills, communication skills, verbal and nonverbal behaviors, interviewing skills. Those skills and those behaviors should be informed by a knowledge base. We have generic concepts which are applicable to any area of social work practice, but we also have specialist knowledge that's been developed theoretically from practice wisdom, but also from research studies and empirical knowledge base. So the left side of the diagram really looks at the way we think and the way, it looks at what we draw on, the knowledge base in our thinking, and skills, what we use in order to enact those complex practice behaviors. But the right side of the diagram are the meta-competencies. What are our assumptions when we go into a practice with a client, a community, a committee? What are our biases? Those that we are aware of and those which operate in an unconscious way but sort of bubble beneath the surface as we engage in critical thinking about the practice situations and as we make decisions. We also know from an enormous amount of neuroscience research that how we think is powerfully influenced by our own feelings, our emotional reactions to the situations we encounter, whether we're able to pause, to take a moment and reflect, whether we have self-awareness and understanding as to how our judgments are influenced by our emotional state. And all of this is subsumed under the label of self-regulation, that ability to see what's going on within us and to contain it in a way that we are not reacting, but we are rather intentionally responding to the client situation that is confronting us. So this is a rather complex, multidimensional approach to thinking about what is the graduate we want to produce. what is the framework that we can use in teaching in university and in teaching in the field. This approach has been taken up and incorporated in the educational policy standards of a number of countries, but not in Canada. So I would now like you again to think about this diagram and to spend some time looking at which of these three competencies of all that I have laid out are the most important for you. So we have the contextual, the professional values, organization, community sensitivity. We have the complex practice behaviors, the use of knowledge, the use of skills, self-regulation, self-awareness, and judgment. All of those emotional pieces. So would you take a moment to just look at this and respond by indicating the three competencies that you would identify as the most important? So let me make sure that you can all see this. So this is very interesting because the great majority of you said self-regulation, self-awareness, and judgment. Well, bravo, I will quote these results because really what you're identifying is the age-old social work notion of use of self, that how we use ourselves, how we feel, and how we think is crucial. So I want to underline this because this is a major lens and focus for you in your field education. We then have a great majority, 80% talking about the context. And that's so true because what we do is highly affected by the context. And so, and then we see that we're looking at the more procedural, the practice behaviors, 41%, the skills, 38%, and the use of knowledge, 41%. So let me now move on to say that the way in which you identify those competencies is really your curriculum for field education. So we don't have time to do this right now, but I would ask you on your own, when you have some time, to think about and write some notes that integrate what you just indicated on these polling questions and what you indicated on the initial polling questions, because that really tells you what your implicit ideas are in terms of what you're looking for in student performance. And if you have a clear idea of what your end goal is, what you're looking for, then that informs you about what content do you want to teach. What is the specialized knowledge and skills that are needed to work in your agency and with your population? So this is the conceptual framework for the next part of the talk, which is how does these frameworks inform the way in which we are teaching in social work education today? I'm thinking that I'm going to pause for a few moments now just to ask if there are any questions about these frameworks, because they are complicated. It's taken us many studies to identify them, and so I just want to give the audience a few minutes if you have any questions for me to clarify the meaning in any of these frameworks. So if anybody has any questions, could you write them in?
Dr. Bogo, it's Annette here. We did have one question that came in as you were presenting from slide 7, and looking at the learning and growth dimension, and how is that defined, in terms of the micro dimensions of learning and growth?
It's defined in a few ways. One is whether the students are realistically and accurately able to identify their strengths, the areas where they're doing well, and the areas that really are weak, that they're uncomfortable with, they haven't mastered, they need more practice. So it's the ability to accurately assess your learning needs. And then the second piece is the ability to take some self-direction, some initiative in finding resources, strategies to address those learning needs. So sometimes we have students who really are quite good at identifying what they need, but they sort of expect the field instructor to do the work. So it's a continuum of students who are quite dependent on the instructor to help them, all the way to a student who says, well, I really need to develop more skill in working with aggressive clients. So I understand that such and such worker in this agency is really good at that. And then ask the field instructor, can I shadow that? Can I ask that instructor, that social worker, if I can shadow them? So that would be an example of learning and growth.
Okay, thank you. There's another question here, but a comment before that. When you started, someone wrote in, a self-aware social worker who is able to locate themselves and treat others with humility and respect. And that was from, the question around what competencies you see as important. A question, though, that's just come in is in terms of interpreting, how would you interpret the information for a BSW versus an MSW student?
Absolutely the same. Absolutely the same. I have a colleague who I work very closely with in California who we've been doing research together, for over 12, 14 years. She's in an only undergraduate program in a small, under-resourced college, and I'm at the University of Toronto, only graduate students, fairly well-resourced. And so when we started this work, it was very important that we partner together and be able to address questions like that. And what our conclusion is after many, many studies is these frameworks and these approaches are definitely useful and effective at all levels of social work practice. I just want to comment on the comment. Yes. Respect and humility, again, study after study show that these are just key dimensions in practice. And Lorraine Gutierrez and Robert Ortega have written about humility, especially with respect to working with difference cross-culturally, cross-racially, that social workers know that they can learn from the client and to approach those situations of difference with humility. Okay, I think we should move on. Thank you, audience, for your questions and comments. So with this rather complex model of holistic competence, I and my research team began to think about how can we develop teaching approaches that will be useful for students to gain holistic competence. We were aware from our work, we work very closely with our field practicum team, that the agencies have experienced increased cutbacks and that resources are more constrained, and that students are often not being observed in their practice in the field. So the concern was that we were assessing students' ability to talk about social work practice, but not to do practice. And so in one of our studies, we interviewed over 100 field instructors, and they said loud and clear, schools need to provide more preparation before they send the students out to the field. We do not have time to teach the very basics. The field instructors also pointed out that many of the schools are teaching critical analysis, theory. They're teaching about practice, and they need to be teaching to do practice. When it came to assessment of students' learning, the evaluation, field instructors said loudly, I signed up to prepare the next generation of social workers. I work from a strengths base. I try to empower, and yet I'm expected now to be the gatekeeper. My values are colliding. And this notion of values colliding has been replicated in very similar studies in social work and in health professions, both in North America and in the UK. So we felt we had to come up with other ways of teaching in the school. And so what we did was start to develop simulation to prepare students with foundation, holistic competence that could be transferred into learning in field education. So we experimented and I'm giving you the example of the MSW program, but my colleague in California does the same in her BSW program. The students do not enter the program and go into the field. Instead, there is a delayed model. We, in Toronto, keep them in the school for the first semester. In other schools, it's for 2 months. It varies, but the idea is they do not go directly into the field. We have 2 linked courses. One is on social work practice, the other is a lab, but they are taught in an integrated way towards holistic competence. Small student groups, 18, with 1 instructor, 6 hours a day, somewhat exhausting, but well worth the effort. What it helps us do is use simulation for very intentional teaching. We have our holistic competency model. We identify the competencies and the learning objectives. We systematically design scenarios so that students are provided with the data that they would need to engage in order to learn the competencies and to demonstrate that they can do the competencies. We involve experienced social workers in the design of all of the scenarios to ensure that they're authentic. We hire and train actors to enact the role, and the instructors are all experienced practitioners, but also very versed in theory, research, and practice. So we're able to teach in this very integrated way. At the end of the course, before they go into the field, we have what's called an OSCE. And those of you who are social workers in the health field know that all health professions use these objective, structured clinical examinations to assess student performance. So we use simulation throughout the term in teaching, and at the end of the term, we use the OSCE to assess students' performance. So the OSCE is a 15-minute interview with a standardized client who is trained to enact the role consistently each time. So it's a very fair exam. Skills are directly observed. There is a set scenario and format. It assesses practice skill implementation, and the performance is evaluated on a set scale by a rater who has no relationship with the student's instructor. And this has become because of the research from field instructors who told us that the relationship makes it very difficult to give the most objective evaluation. It's that values collide dilemma. So this is a diagram. We have the simulated interview, and immediately following the 15-minute interview, we have a reflection, because the simulated interview can assess, again, if you think about the holistic competence diagram, the interview assesses the procedural competencies, the skills, and the complex practice behaviors. But to get at the meta-competencies, what knowledge are they using? What is going on in terms of cognitive and affective processes? What is going on inside the social worker? Use of self, critical thinking, how they apply knowledge. Immediately after conducting the interview, they go to our computer lab and they have about 25 minutes to answer questions that are directly keyed to these dimensions of holistic competence. So in the courses, you can see from this diagram, they are very well prepared for this final OSCE. We have many role plays, and we have 3 simulated client sessions. They do a role play interview, they video record it, they analyze it. Here is where, again, they link theory, research, and practice. They identify the skills, they identify the complex practice behaviors, and they reflect and critique on their own performance and what was going on for them. So by the time they come to the OSCE, they really have had a lot of experience in working and learning through simulation. We also develop a learning group where we focus on this learning and growth dimension, self-assessment of learning goals, and strategies. All of this gets incorporated into what we call a lab evaluation summary, which is then taken to the field on their first day of field. So what we came up with, again, through research on simulation, on the left-hand side of this slide is that complex model that I presented earlier. But we also have learned from our research on teaching and learning that these appear to be the key dimensions. And why I'm presenting them is because they are very much transferable to teaching in the field. Observing practice, providing focused feedback, and providing guided reflection. And I will talk much more about that in the next segment. But before I get to the field segment, let me show you the bridge to the field. So we have the classroom. We have what's called Practice Fridays. This is a voluntary enhancement held on Friday where students can come and practice with a simulated client, small group, usually 10 to 12 students, classroom instructor, and we always have field instructors present who are also giving very valuable feedback to our students. We then have the OSCE, and the practicum then begins. When the students start the practicum, they bring their lab evaluation to the field instructors. And so we surveyed 179 field instructors, 68 of whom responded, and they felt that this preparation using simulation was absolutely marvelous. They said it provided them with a baseline competence, some sense of what the student had already learned, what they were able to do. It enabled the students to be very open, and the openness enabled the field instructors to really form a relationship quite early. A lot of the instructors said things like, I was able to say to the student, I'm so impressed with you that you can come on day one and say to me, this is what I'm good in, this is what I'm struggling with, this is how I felt about doing the OSCE. So it created a relationship and really helped to engage students in learning very quickly. The field instructors also talked about how students were able to talk about their performance anxiety, what they'd learned about self-regulation, and the importance of self-care. So all in all, the field instructors in our community were so positive about the impact of simulation in preparing students for the field. And here's just an example of more. We now have simulation throughout our courses, and it's very much done as a partnership with the field. For example, we recently developed a whole simulation on working in mental health, and our field instructors from our leading mental health agency have been part of it, part of the development, and part of all the papers that we write. So, last question. In your community, what factors would influence your school to use simulation? Student interest, faculty members who can teach practice, field directors, the program director or the dean, pressure from the professional association, presence of university funds for pedagogical innovation. So if you could just spend a moment responding, and then let me just let you see faculty members who can teach practice. Yep, that is the crucial factor for sure, and often we have faculty members who are very good at talking about practice, analyzing practice, critiquing practice, but they can't do it. And that's a real frustration for students. Student interest, that's important, and definitely presence of university funds for pedagogical innovation. We also found the support of our field director was crucial, and having a champion in the program director or the dean really made it happen. So let me simply leave you with the thought that if you're interested in having your school move ahead to think about and adopt simulation, we have many, many papers, and all of our lessons learned are summarized in the Using Simulation in Assessment and Teaching. This book came out in 2014, and the book Social Work Practice just came out 2018. It underpins our approach, and the whole holistic competence model is well described. I also want to say that we've trained many doctoral students in the use of simulation, and I'm happy to say they are now on staff at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, University of Calgary, Laurentian University in Barrie, and Carleton University. So I now have 4 fully trained, wonderful new faculty members who are doing great work with simulation, well supported by research grants and by universities. So if anybody is interested in this very interesting approach to social work education, I encourage you to get in touch with those people and see what kind of partnerships can be formed. So I'm going to stop now and give you the opportunity to ask questions about this phase on simulation. Questions or comments before we move on to the next and last segment of the webinar.
Okay, Dr. Bogo, there's a couple questions that came in. One, is there data on the student perception of the OSCE?
Yes. In our first paper, and again, I think I listed some references. Yes, I listed references at the end of the webinar. Our first paper on OSCE was 2011. I don't think I listed it there. In any case, no, I didn't list it there. That's interesting. 2011, outstanding. Students love it. They went into it anxious, and they leave feeling confident that they can now engage more, feeling that they know something when they go into the field. There's also a critical appraisal of the research that we did. Carmen Logie, former doctoral student, led that project, and we analyzed the results from about 16, 17 studies. Students really love it. Mm-hmm. So very, very positive uptake on the part of students. We do much more now about teaching them how to contain their anxiety so they see it as a learning opportunity, and they don't get so dysregulated.
Right. Okay. Someone had a practical question regarding the Practice Fridays. For the field instructors that are present, do they come as volunteers or are they compensated for their time? How does that work?
They come as volunteers, and the feedback from them has been that they have learned about how to give focused feedback, because the instructors who run the Practice Fridays through trial and error and a lot of experimenting and some research, we've really learned that focused feedback is really important. So the input from the field instructors is that it's been value added for them, and some of them have actually started using simulation learning experiences in their own agencies. There's a very nice paper in the online journal called The Field Educator, written by one of our field instructors about this.
Actually, one of the comments that came in was the number one factor that would influence use of simulation. They listed field instructor involvement.
Good.
Good. Yeah, that was a comment that came in.
It's one more. It's the field instructors who need to pressure the schools to be teaching practice, not only putting it on the backs of the field instructors.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Another question that came in is, have you used this method in rural practice with small numbers of students and field supervision from working staff?
We haven't, but there's a lot of online programs now developing in Canada and in the U.S., and there's a lot of experimenting going with using simulation online. Kent Asakura at Carleton University is going to be leading these initiatives in his simulation research lab. So I would keep an eye, Asakura, Asakura. I'd keep an eye on him.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. In terms of, you mentioned that you teach students about self-regulation. Someone's wondering if there's a specific course for that.
There is a specific course in the second year, but in our first-year preparatory course, we do a tremendous amount of work we use mindfulness techniques, we use deep breathing, we have special workshops, and we have students reflect on their experience at the end of every 6-hour class. It's a written reflection. Again, if anybody's interested in any of our instruments, just email me. My email, I think, is at the end of this power presentation. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. It is. Please just email me. We are very big on sharing all our materials.
So that leads to another question that we had, and then maybe we could move on, but
Sure.
Could you speak to how you're able to, and if they're able to, share this information with others?
Oh, yeah. I mean, at this stage, all we want to do is disseminate. And we had a very good website, which is not working, but we are going to get it up and going again. We have podcasts. If any of you like the In Social Work is the University at Buffalo. They've done podcasts with us, and the Social Work podcast series run by Jonathan Singer from Loyola University. They have podcasts, so you can kind of learn more about it by listening to those podcasts as you drive around, commute, or go jogging or walking. And all of our materials are in the Using Simulation book, and I'm just happy to email anybody who wants any of our materials. Just email me and tell me what you want, and I will send the stuff to you. So thank you for all these interesting comments and questions. Let's now move to field education. So could you select what two practices do you rate the most highly in your field education experience? The organization and team, the relationship, the case assignments, readings, process records, observation of others, being observed, feedback and coaching, and mutual reflective dialogues. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong one. No. We were doing so well. I can't see the results.
Okay.
Annette, can you help? I can't see the results.
I'm just waiting for Tech to jump in there. I am not seeing the poll results there either.
I just saw them. Oh, but
you just saw them? Okay.
Yeah. Oh, no, there they are. They're there.
Okay, perfect.
Yes. Now let me let you all see them. Oh, now I lost them.
Maybe you can just read it out.
Okay. So let me see. Okay, 50% said supportive field instructor-student relationship. The research totally supports this, and I will discuss that further. Then 41% said feedback and coaching and mutual reflective discussions. Absolutely. Observation, only 33%. Observation of others, 8%. And welcoming team. Okay, that's interesting. So let's take a look at what the best practices are for field education. And there is a tremendous amount of research, again, from around the world. Lots of good stuff from Hong Kong, from the UK, from Ireland, North America, lots from Canada. Context affects learning. Of course, we know that as social workers. We're embedded in organizations, and systems are key. So, strong, positive learning environments in organizations and teams. And we may have time later to talk about the importance of learning organizations, important for staff and important for students. But what's been very interesting is even in organizations that are going through change and there's a lot of difficulty, there's angst, there can even be very unpleasant team dynamics. If the relationship with the field instructor is supportive and calming, it can override the negative impact of the environment. So we did a very interesting study a number of years ago where we asked students who had had traumatic, difficult experiences in the practicum. We asked them if we could interview them. And we did it in a few schools of social work. And, you know, we heard stories about the students whose clients had committed suicide, students who were in organizations or teams that were undergoing tremendous cutbacks with a lot of very negative issues in the atmosphere. And yet, if the field instructor was able to contain the students' emotional reaction to that, they were able to still learn and develop and not be adversely affected by the environment. So, again, this supports the importance of the relationship. But the relationship should not only be supportive and calming, it also needs to be challenging. So let me move on then to the learning teaching processes that, as I say, a lot of research has supported. The first is the importance of practice. Sometimes I get concerned that our students don't get enough actual practice, as in if you were learning to play the piano, you'd be practicing and practicing. Why is practice so important? New neuroscience research really shows that we need actions to strengthen new learning. And new learning is about making neuronal connections. And in order for the brain to learn, we can't just sit there passively, listening or watching. We have to be doing. So we need to take that new knowledge and make sense of it. It needs to be relevant to us, and it needs to build on existing knowledge. In other words, learners really need to construct the new knowledge for themselves. They need to make it meaningful. And so there is a fairly new theory called deliberate practice. And it's the idea, it comes from research in social psychology, but we have seen it through our simulation research. You need to focus your attention on what you need to learn. In a field setting, presented with the complex cases that we see in practice, students and social workers can be overwhelmed by the multitude of stimuli coming at them. And so the field instructor needs to help students focus their attention on what's important. Again, what's important for this particular student to develop in relation to that competence model. And so you need to identify the areas. You need to help students focus on it. They need to practice. They need to rehearse. So practice again and again, maybe role play in preparation for going back into a practice situation. So really the first dimension is practicing. We then come to the second dimension, which is observation and feedback. And the question really is, how can you have a reflective dialogue about something that you have not actually seen? How can you give feedback on skills if you have not seen the skills in action? And so practice gets lost in the telling, and instruction becomes instruction in the dark. However, we know from a number of studies and our own experience that students are often not observed in their practice. There really is the human tendency to distort. So in some of our simulations, we sit here as the rater and we watch a student conduct a 15-minute interview. The student immediately goes to the computer lab, as I described earlier, and writes about their recall of what they did, what impact it had, why they did it. The student then brings that reflection back to the rater, who reads the reflection and compares it to the interview that they actually observed. Over the last 5-6 years, I have rated hundreds of these OSCEs. And there are always a number of students who write about what they observed that in a way that did not match what they observed. For example, one student was interviewing a very lifelike, authentic, elderly female who was talking about her multiple losses of family, struggling with whether or not she should move into assisted living. And the client began to cry. And I observed the interaction. The student then went to the lab and wrote what she did. And what she wrote was, the client began to cry. I leaned forward. I tried to express concern and empathy for the client's losses. I took a Kleenex from the box on the table and I gave it to the client. In fact, this did not happen. What in fact happened was the client started crying. The student started to wring her hands. She sat back in her chair. She did not say anything. She looked very uncomfortable. She took a Kleenex and she blew her own nose. I tell you this story because this student was not lying. I think this student was writing about what she knew she should have done. However, by observing her in the moment, I could see that she was not able to do that. So what we concluded is that students can talk the talk. They can tell the field instructor, this is what I did in the interview. But whether or not they can actually do it, whether or not they walk the walk, we only know if we observe the students in practice. There also is a considerable body of research called Unskilled and Unaware. And this comes not only from social work, but from health professions research. And these are the people who think they are doing far better than they are actually doing. And so there are a lot of very concerning reports of nursing students, medical residents who overrate their performance. And when they are shown exemplar videos of good performance, they even overrate their performance even more so. So seeing exemplars does not help them develop a more accurate rating of their own abilities. This is actually very frightening work when you think about we are graduating in the health professions people who are unskilled but also unaware of it. So I know I'm going on a bit at length here, but if I have one take-home message, it's the importance of observation. The other issue is we have a lot of reports that field instruction has become very administratively focused. Now, these reports are very much from the UK in child welfare, so I'm not sure to what extent we can generalize to our experience in Canada. However, the administrative focus is really what's happening with the client, what should we do next. So the focus is not on student learning and performance. It's really on the client needs, which of course is crucial and important, but it's not educationally focused. The last thing I want to say about observing students is that students are anxious about being observed. We're all anxious about being observed. But what we know is that in many areas of social work practice, our practice is not private, it's public. We're working in health and mental health settings where others are observing what we're doing and learning how to practice and be observed when you're a student is a lot easier than when you're a very experienced practitioner. The other thing that I learned very early on in this is the concept of role induction. And that is that we introduce from the beginning, this is the way we learn in social work. You will observe me in my practice, and we will debrief together so that I can tell you what knowledge was I drawing on, what are my implicit biases, assumptions, what was my emotional state. I can model as the field instructor how I learn, how I practice, and how then you can learn as a student how to practice. So role induction has become a very useful approach to helping students become less anxious and more comfortable about being observed. And then we develop a lot of strategies, self-care strategies, anxiety diminishing strategies, such as deep breathing, mindfulness. Some people do a lot of exercise. spirituality, the whole range of self-care approaches that have been introduced into social work literature. Finally, when we talk about observing role models, we know from social learning theory how effective this can be. So basically what this slide talks about is that when we observe people, we have the best opportunity for debriefing and feedback. We then can coach, really give specific feedback, help students rehearse, usually through role play, maybe through watching you, the field instructor, deal effectively with whatever the issue is. And then the importance of having the chance to practice again, and through the next piece, linking theory and practice, we really are teaching in a way that integrates all the dimensions of holistic competence. So we now come to the piece on reflective discussion. And years ago, I came up with this integration of theory and practice loop. And basically, it starts with retrieving what actually happened, a process of reflecting on it. And we've now kind of made reflection more specific. So it's what is going on within the social worker, those meta-competencies. We can also reflect on what's happening at a micro level, what was going on between you and the client or clients at a meso level, what is going on in the context that's important. And with our focus on social justice and diversity, reflection becomes an excellent time for us to integrate in a meaningful way structural systemic issues that may be impacting on the client, social worker, client-student interaction, and macro policies, procedures, agency, guidelines that are also impacting on whatever is transpiring. Linking all of this to a knowledge base. So here we have the importance of linking the phenomenon in the practice situation, what's going on within us and around us, and linking it to what students may be learning in their classes and to what your preferred frameworks are for practice. So this refers to what I spoke about earlier, your curriculum. Every field instructor has their own beliefs in what is crucial for students to learn. So it's very useful if you can articulate what is your curriculum, what are your beliefs, what are your frameworks, and if you can convey that directly to students. And all of this then comes together in forming the next professional response between the student and their client. So sort of pulling this all together, when reflective discussions are grounded in observation, students gain a more complex understanding of the rationale for the field instructor's suggestions, which leads to intentional practice. We go from abstractions to practice, and students can internalize the theoretical premises of the field instructor through coaching and feedback with reflecting on what happened in practice, and we can examine and help students examine the meta-competencies, their emotions, their cognitions, and their self-regulation. So in summary, the best practices, supportive relationships that are also challenging, multiple practice opportunities, observation and feedback, and reflective discussions that link concepts to practice. On your own, I hope you can give some thought to I am best at, I could do better at, and things that I would like to do differently. I also have a couple of slides on what students can do, examining practice through the lens of concepts taught at school. You don't have to teach everything. Students should be bringing in their knowledge base. Read and discuss the best readings so you can give them your favorite readings, which help students to develop critical thinking. Students can develop awareness of their own emotional state, their triggers, and how to self-regulate. They can develop reflective capacity so that they can be mindful and respond rather than react. So these are the dimensions in the holistic competence model which students can take the initiative to work on. They also can record their practice, of course, with informed consent from clients, but with iPhones and iPads, it's very easy to record your practice. They can review and analyze their practice, and it's unrealistic to expect the field instructor to watch reams of practice data. So students can bring segments where they felt they did well and present that to their instructor, so you actually get a sense of students' competence. But they should also bring segments where they have struggled, so that you can go through the loop of retrieval, linkage, planning the next event, where you can have discussion, you can role play practice, you may suggest they observe you or they observe someone else, and students can then be prepared for their next meeting with the client. So much of what I've talked about regarding field education is captured in these two books. One that I wrote, the one on the left, was originally written in the late 80s, and then the second edition came out in 1998, and it was we had a big grant, so most schools of social work would have that somewhere. And then the Achieving Competence book came out in 2010, and it summarizes a lot of what I've been talking about. On the next slide, I have the selected references, the books, the resources, the podcast, and on this slide, this article, 2015, is one that you can easily access. It's in Clinical Social Work Journal, and it's a summary of a lot of what I was discussing. I should also say that there is a wonderful special issue of the Clinical Social Work Journal coming out soon that I've been the guest editor, but most of the accepted papers are now available online. All you have to do is Google Clinical Social Work Journal, and you will see online first, and there's tons of papers now about field education, and there's also a whole special issue on staff supervision for those of you who are interested. So we have about 10 more minutes for comments, questions, and so forth.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Bogo. Such excellent presentation. So keep your questions coming. I do have a lot of questions that have already come in, so we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Dr. Bogo, someone was wondering if there's evidence to support shadowing as an effective educational strategy in social work education. This person works with an organization that does not allow it because they think it's not effective and not very acceptable to the clients. So what are some alternatives to shadowing in such cases that are still competency-based?
Shadowing an experienced worker?
Yes.
Okay. Showing video recordings of good practice, of normal practice where we all make mistakes and try and figure out how to recover and repair. So video recordings are very, very useful, and if the agency refuses to burden the clients with that contribution to education, you can use simulation, and that's what we do a fair amount of. In the school, we have simulated clients, and we have our experienced clinical instructors, faculty members who are good clinicians, and we video record the interviews, and then we have students watch those interviews, and we debrief. So we keep stopping the interview, and we use that to discuss the various aspects of holistic competence. So if the agency doesn't allow shadowing, to find other ways of using video, perhaps using simulation, even using a colleague to play the role of a client so that students can actually see good practice. Students complain a lot about, we talk about practice, we don't show them practice. Is there evidence to suggest that? I'm not sure if there's evidence just about shadowing, but there certainly is a lot of evidence that we learn through watching, but watching isn't enough. It's got to be accompanied by intentional, focused debriefing. Otherwise, it becomes what I call the soap opera scenario. As students sort of sit back and lose themselves in the story.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned earlier at the beginning of the presentation about, there are some universities that have well-resourced social work programs and others that have poorly resourced social work programs. And what will be the difference between those schools of social work?
Well, it depends on the universities. A lot of universities now have really gone into providing funds for education projects, and that's how a lot of the simulation projects have gotten started. Some universities, just by virtue of their budget model, have more money to give to things like simulation, extra resources for field, and other universities or small departments who are operating on a tighter budget, so they don't have the extra funds for the faculty to be doing more creative, innovative approaches to preparing students for practice. Because please remember, my whole presentation is about educating effective social workers who know how to practice, not just know how to critique social issues.
Yes, that's right. Another question that came in is, and I guess it was just a wondering question, what impact the direct observation would have on the imposter syndrome?
That's what was so interesting. The first few times we ran the OSCEs, the students said, I didn't really know if I knew enough to go out into the field. But getting the feedback from the rater who didn't know them, had no relationship with them, and getting that feedback incorporated in the lab evaluation, where we really specifically identified your strengths and your areas to work on, it seemed to totally undercut the imposter syndrome because students said in our research, I now feel more confident and ready to go out into the field. And that's because, this feeling imposter syndrome is very much a global kind of feeling. They're going to find me out. Here comes the fraud squad. But the kind of feedback we give with the OSCE is very specific. So we're able to say, these are your strengths, and these are the areas you need to work on. So it really undercuts that global sense, I'm not good enough. Mm-hmm. It's been very effective in undercutting it.
Excellent, thank you. Another question just came in. How would you propose integrating a simulation program in a distance delivery program?
Well, this is an area where I really don't know very much, but take a look at the website of the University of Southern California. They have been doing this for a number of years, and if you can Google around it, you might be able to come up with what they're doing. They have a big program to prepare social workers to work with veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan who have PTSD. And so they end up with a virtual lab with a number of students online at the same time, with an instructor and an actor who himself is a vet with PTSD. And the demonstrations that I've seen of that have been very, very compelling. Mm-hmm. Simmons College in Boston came up to visit us here, see what we were doing, and they now are incorporating the use of simulation in distance education. So I think this is sort of the future for rural and remote online programs that are reaching rural and remote communities.
Mm-hmm. Okay, wonderful. Last question. In terms of, do you use or can you share a rubric or checklist to compile feedback for simulation?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Just email me.
Okay. All right, wonderful. Unfortunately, that's all the time we do have for questions. We're coming to the top of the 90 minutes there now, and I do want to take an opportunity to express a sincere thank you to Dr. Bogle for this stellar presentation and for sharing her knowledge and experience and expertise with us today. Field education is a fundamental aspect of social work programs across the country. And as social workers, we foster environments where student learning can flourish every time we agree to provide field education or instruction and take students under our wings. While this may have its challenges, it also brings tremendous opportunities for us to have a lasting impact on the education of our future social work colleagues. Today's presentation provided a lot of great information on preparing for and enhancing the field education experience. This is something we can use regardless of our area of practice, and it may have inspired you to take on more students, or to take a student for the first time, or to try something new in the way that you provide field education. So thank you again to Dr. Bogle for joining us from Ontario, and I'm here in Newfoundland and Labrador, for facilitating this excellent session today. It is truly appreciated. The recording of this presentation and the slides will be uploaded to the websites of the Newfoundland and Labrador Association of Social Workers and the Canadian Association of Social Workers for your future reference. For those of you who attended 75 minutes or more of this presentation, confirmation of attendance is available now by clicking the yellow icon at the bottom right of your window. I also encourage everyone to complete the evaluation that will appear on your screen as well. So thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful day. And Dr. Bogle, I don't know if you wanted to say a few words in wrapping up.
Well, I'm just trying to, there's my email for anybody who would like to reach me. And I do want to say, in wrapping up, field instructors are really the most pivotal, important people in the social work education enterprise. Study after study shows that students, graduates, alumni always say it was in the field that they really learned to put it all together. And one of the nice catchphrases that is used in North America is field is the heart of social work education. So a shout out and thank you to all the social workers who take students.
Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much.